This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. We're in an off year for elections. There's no big presidential race this year, or in Vermont, there's no elections for congressional reps or state reps or governor or anything else like that. Your town might be holding a vote on Election Day next week, but again, if you're in Vermont, there is no big statewide race or anything you're going to need to weigh in on November 4th. While the pressure's off, people who focus on ballot access have some time to do their work. Later in the show, we'll hear from Vermont's Secretary of State, Sarah Copeland-Hansis. Her office has launched a task force to increase voter participation in 4 historically underserved populations. One of them is Vermont's incarcerated population. Vermont, Maine, and Washington, D.C. are the only 3 jurisdictions in the country that allow people behind bars to vote. An organization that advocates for criminal justice reform called the Sentencing Project has been studying these 3 places. This summer, they released a report about how voting unfolds in Maine and Vermont prisons. Our guest today authored that report. Kristen Budd is a senior research analyst at the Sentencing Project. Kristen, welcome to Vermont Edition.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's a joy to be here.
We're very glad to have you. And we are also joined by Tim Burgess of the organization VT Cure. He himself voted while he was incarcerated, and he now works on lots of issues that affect Vermont's incarcerated population, including access to the ballot. Tim, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us from Hardwick in our Colchester studios. And listeners, if you have questions for our guest this hour, you can call in at 800-639-2211. You can also tell us what you think of Vermont and Maine's voter programs for people who are in jail or prison. Again, our number is 800-639-2211, or you can email vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Kristen, can we start out here by you telling us the broad goals of producing this report? I mean, I think it's important to be clear with listeners in saying that the Sentencing Project would like to see all states allow incarcerated people to vote. Yes?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. We want everyone to be able to vote regardless of criminal legal involvement, or if they are currently completing a prison sentence, or if they are currently in jail.
And what were your goals with creating this report? Is it supposed to be something of a guideline for other states?
You can look at it as somewhat of a lessons learned, because there is movements, which I believe we'll touch on later, in states to once again re-enfranchise those who have lost their vote in prisons throughout the United States. So as we see more individuals being able to vote while they're in jails or while they're in prison, we wanted to know, well, how can we do it the best we can? So Maine and Vermont have never disenfranchised, so they were the perfect states to say, hey, can we work with you? Can we see how you have your voting policies within your facilities? Can we see what you're doing? Can we get feedback from incarcerated residents? Like, what do they think is going really well? What are things that make it harder for them to vote? So the goal is to hopefully provide a lessons learned. So as more places implement voting, that they can learn from Maine and Vermont and take the things that work really well, and then also be aware of roadblocks that could potentially exist that make things harder, and they can address those in advance.
Tim, I'm really glad we have you here with us, because you both advocate for folks who are incarcerated and also have been incarcerated yourself, and you know what it's like to vote while in prison during 2 different elections, right?
Yeah. Yes. So first of all, I want to thank the Sentencing Project, because they're doing amazing work in this area. So for myself, I voted in 2006, was the first election when I was incarcerated, and then for president in 2008. Yep.
All right, so midterms and big presidential race. Did you know already that you had the right to vote when you entered Northwest State Correctional Facility, or was that something you found out once you were there?
Because of my history of working in the political arena, I knew that I could vote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And were you the person that told other folks there that they had the right to vote?
Yeah. So you start a conversation. You being incarcerated, people will the guys in there will say, I don't like this or I don't like that. And that's sort of a natural avenue to say, do you vote? Have you ever registered to vote? So, yeah.
Kristen, one of the things that really struck me about your report was that it found that half of the people that you interviewed who are incarcerated said that they learned about their voting rights from another incarcerated resident, somebody like Tim, like you were, and only 11% learned about that right from corrections staff. Another 10% learned about it from a case manager, and the rest learned about that right from, an outside organization or TV or news or something like that. Did that surprise you as well?
That did surprise me. So, especially for Vermont. So, Vermont has a voting rights policy, and they also have a staff guidance document. So, as we were doing our work, we were reviewing things that were publicly available. And part of that policy is that staff should be alerting folks that they still have the right to vote during their incarceration. And what we found, we did a pen and paper survey with incarcerated individuals in both Maine and Vermont. And it was that they were learning by word of mouth versus learning from staff. And then you also have a very active NAACP branch at the Maine State Prison. So they were doing the work of voter education to make sure individuals who came into the facilities knew that they maintain their voting rights, that they can vote while they are there. So I think part of it is our recommendation is for more staff training, because you have certain individual staff who are tasked with these responsibilities, but then the message is not sent to the rest of staff, either through onboarding or training materials, just so everyone has the same baseline knowledge that people can still vote who are residents of Maine and Vermont, who are serving sentences there or within the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Mm-hmm. Tim, do you remember having any conversations with staff, or have you heard since you've been doing this advocacy work about staff at Vermont correctional facilities facilitating this process?
So, excuse me. So, in the last 2 years, the department has really started taking on a bigger role and being active in getting people to vote. When I was incarcerated, which was 20 years ago, it wasn't not encouraged, but it wasn't actively engaging people to do it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Maybe not as much of a priority.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to vote in prison, you have to request an absentee ballot, which seems like it could be a logistical challenge. Is that something that you studied in this report, Kristen?
We did. We asked on our survey to incarcerated residents, what was one of the challenges that they faced? Report, tell us. And one thing that did come up is they were like, all right, mailing things, and the mail is so slow because you not only have internal security checks, then it goes out into, the neighborhood community mailing system. Then you also have clerk's office. When are they open? And then also with that mailing process on the way back, right? Is it classified as legal mail? Is it getting to the residents quicker so they can make sure that they can meet all the deadlines so that they can then mail their absentee ballots back? So the speed of mail is unpredictable, and that's how that absentee ballot works, is you are putting so much onus on the mail to get from point A to point B in a timely manner, and everything in prison takes a lot longer because of those additional layers of security. So it does slow things down. So people who are incarcerated, staff should be alerting them really early, like as soon as possible. Like, it's time. If you want to vote, we need to get your things in the mail so you can get that back and forth done, because it's a lot. So it does take a lot of time to do that.
And if I may add to Kristen's point, there's a lot of transient population. In other words, you could be in Northwest state one day and in Mississippi potentially the next day. Mm-hmm. So if you order an absentee ballot and you're at St. Albans, it's a whole lot different, because the mail system, as Kristen pointed out, is arduous and the population moves so frequently that ballots can get lost, things like that.
Is there a way to fix that? Tim, do you have any ideas? Like, I don't know, like more in-person voting? I know that's not a possibility right now.
Well, I suppose if I had a soapbox and I could get up on it.
I think that's what this is.
I would say, we do same-day voting. You can walk in if you're in the community, right? You can walk in and vote that day.
Yeah.
And, maybe same-day voting. I think that's a big ask for people who are incarcerated, but it could certainly simplify the arduous process of calling your town clerk, getting the ballot.
Yeah. Yeah, Kristen, one of your recommendations in this report is to have in-person voting in prison. But like Tim is saying, there are many logistical challenges to that. Can you talk us through your thought process around it?
Well, if I could wave the magic wand, right, and take away all the logistical challenges to bringing in tabulators and such into facilities, the easiest solution would be having on-site polling stations where, and they do this in Washington, D.C., where incarcerated residents are trained, they get paid, they run the polls. You have same-day in-person registration now in the district. They passed that in 2022. It's how can we take that model and then expand that model to be in states like Maine and Vermont, where it essentially removes a lot of the barriers that we're talking about in our report that deal with limited access to paperwork, delays in prison mail, especially external to the facility, and then also this lack of person power and capacity to do this work across all facilities. So if you could bring in those polling stations, you're alleviating all those resource constraints and person power constraints. So I feel like there's some very smart people that could get this done if they put their heads together and work through those logistical issues to bring in those polling stations to give our voters access.
If you have questions about access to the ballot in Vermont or Maine prisons, you can call in at 800-639-2211. Or maybe you yourself have voted while incarcerated. We would love to hear your story this hour. You can also write in to Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. So to vote in prison, you have to request an absentee ballot. You have to have an interest in voting, feel like it's important, like your vote matters. And you also need to get some information about candidates, which I imagine can be very tough for lots of reasons while you're in prison. Last year, I reported on a first-of-its-kind candidate forum inside a Vermont prison that the Department of Corrections helped facilitate. There were some candidates running for governor and for U.S. congressional positions, but those are rare. And I was also privy to all the planning conversations that went into it, and it was a lot. I'd love to hear from both of you about ways in which getting information about candidates in prison is difficult and how we could help address that. Tim, I'll start with you.
So getting information while you're incarcerated about a lot of things that are happening in the community is difficult.
Yeah.
And a lot of that information is shared through the Community High School of Vermont, and we can thank Bob Lucenti for that. But to the question, it is about statewide issues. It's about statewide and federal candidates, but it's also about community issues. What is my library budget? Why would I care if I'm incarcerated, right? So did that answer your question?
Yeah. So how can we better get that information to people who are incarcerated? Like, did you have access to newspapers or blogs when you were voting in 06 and 08?
So the way I got the information was through newspapers. Mm-hmm. Every facility back in the Stone Age of 2006, we had access to daily papers. Now there's access to tablets. And a lot of these folks who are incarcerated can I don't know what kind of access they can get to information about local select board members or things like that, but those are avenues.
Yeah. Kristen, what did you learn about access to candidate information when you were interviewing folks who are incarcerated in Vermont and Maine?
Yeah, so I actually went in person to Vermont to collect the data for this report, and I also attended the candidate forum that they had. So I returned there upon invitation, which was really wonderful. So, as I'm going around the units and, we're passing out the survey, et cetera, you get an opportunity to talk to the guys that are in there. And, one of the questions that does come up is like, how do you learn about who's running for office? And, they would tell us that it's just the hard copies of the newspapers and those types of things. They're just disappearing. They're like, we don't really see them much anymore, right? So this is problematic because internet access is extremely limited. And this is also something that we advocate for in our report is that, these individuals should at minimum have access to their state-run government website that talks about voting, that talks about referendums. I don't understand why the access to those official websites would be blocked, but that could be an additional way. I went to a library conference, and there's lots of wonderful librarians out there that you can write to and get hard copies. They'll photocopy for you things about candidates and candidates' information. Disability Rights Vermont is extremely active in the facilities with in-person voter registration. They also do, voter guides that can be in the prison so the individuals can read things like those. And then just swinging back to the tablets, I'm not sure how much access is on those. I mean, internet is pretty locked down, but to get those paid subscriptions, it's quite expensive, right? So that's something you have to keep in mind is cost, is can these individuals afford to pay that access fee to be able to get, subscriptions to news and things like that. So that could be prohibitive too.
We're talking about voting rights for people who are incarcerated in Vermont and Maine. Those are the only two states in the U.S. where incarcerated people have the right to vote. We have to take a short break here, but stick around because when we come back, Vermont's Secretary of State, Sarah Copeland-Hansis, is going to chime in. This is Vermont Edition. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. This hour, we're talking about a unique part of Vermont's voter base, people who are in prison. Vermont, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. are the only three jurisdictions in the country where incarcerated people can vote. But that doesn't mean that all of them, or even a majority of them, cast ballots. There are a lot of barriers to voting when you're in prison. Our guests are Kristen Budd, Senior Research Analyst at the Sentencing Project and the author of a new report about Vermont and Maine's incarcerated voting programs, and Tim Burgess. He's the Executive Director of Vermont Cure, which supports Vermont's incarcerated population in lots of different ways. Now, there are efforts to increase voter turnout at the grassroots level, as we've been discussing with Tim, and from the top down. We're joined now by Vermont's Secretary of State, Sarah Copeland-Hansis. Her office has launched a task force to increase voter turnout among 4 different communities in the state. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Michaela.
So could you tell us about who exactly you're trying to reach out to with this new task force?
Yeah, thank you so much. We're really excited to launch this next week, about a year ahead of the 2026 general election. It's going to be focused on 4 groups of Vermonters who we know have some barriers. So that includes people who are currently unhoused, people with disabilities, vision disabilities, mobility, dexterity disabilities, folks who are participants in our Safe at Home program, and then also Vermonters who are incarcerated.
And the goal is to increase turnout for the 2026 election?
Yeah, we really want to identify what the barriers are that these folks are experiencing so that we can work within the election officials in our state and within the systems that we have to try to reduce those barriers and increase turnout. So I've really appreciated hearing Kristen and Tim talking about some of those barriers and also posing some potential solutions.
Kristen, what do we know about turnout among Vermont's incarcerated population and how it compares to the general population?
So I don't have information on comparison statistics, but some of the work that we cited in our report, I think comes out of MIT. And I mean, it's less than 10%, and that's from, prior elections. So turnout is low. So that's part of the impetus to figure out, well, what are these barriers and how can we increase that number for voters who want to participate?
Secretary, one of the Sentencing Project's recommendations, which we were also talking about with Tim Burgess, is waving a magic wand and having in-person voting in prisons as a way to increase access to the ballot box. What do you think? Is that possible?
Well, that presents some challenges, and I think it's important for listeners to understand that in Vermont, you don't gain residency in the community where you are incarcerated. In fact, you maintain residency in your last address within the state of Vermont. And so, that could effectively mean setting up hundreds of different tabulators or finding a way to retrieve ballots that need to be distributed to hundreds of different town or city clerks.
That seems easy.
So that's one of yes, that's one of the logistical challenges. Of course, the other challenge is that we do have some incarcerated Vermonters who are in Mississippi, and we would want to be able to set up a system that will work equally for Vermonters who are incarcerated in St. Albans and Springfield as for the folks who are in the out-of-state facility. So we're going to be looking at all of the challenges and really thinking about all of the potential solutions. And I think that because we have folks at the Department of Corrections who are willing and ready to be partners with us in this, we can talk about any number of different solutions that we could use to increase voting participation.
Tim had mentioned earlier in our conversation that when he was incarcerated, he was the person that actually talked to a lot of his fellow inmates and let them know, right, Tim, that they had the right to vote while in prison.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I think another obstacle that may not be recognized is there's sometimes very difficult learning disabilities. Mm-hmm. So if someone can't read or write, how do you have them write a letter to their town clerk? So, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Secretary Copeland-Hansis, is that something that you see any straightforward solutions to?
So we have certainly identified that it is more challenging for people who are incarcerated to even get registered to vote, and that first step of being able to vote and to be automatically mailed your general election ballot is to be on the voter registration rolls in your community. So there are a couple of different solutions to that. One would be to see if the Department of Corrections, through their educational programming, can allow incarcerated individuals to get into the Vermont voter portal, where you can update your voter registration or transfer your voter registration to your last known address. That would be a good way to get folks registered to begin with. And, there's another aspect of that I think has been challenging, and that is that there's some staffing challenges within the Department of Corrections that have sometimes made it hard to keep those educational programs going for incarcerated folks so that they can have access to that. So we'll be unpacking that with them as well.
Kristen, in producing this report, you interviewed a number of staffers at Vermont's Department of Corrections. I'm curious how that process went. Was the department willing to work with you on this and make staffers available to comment?
Yeah, Vermont was great to work with. The DOC staff we talked to were very open, and I thought it was a really great working relationship. So we appreciated their willingness to let us come in and ask questions, because not all DOCs are usually willing to do that.
Yeah. Well, we got an email from a listener named Nora, and I'd love to get all three of our guests' thoughts on this one. Nora wrote in to say that incarceration means losing your rights until you've been released and can re-enter the population. Incarcerated individuals should not have the right to vote. Now, whether or not they should have the right to vote is a separate debate. The fact is that in Vermont, they do have the right to vote. But what is up for debate, I guess, is how much time and resources we put into this program to increase the turnout of folks who are incarcerated. Folks like Nora might not want to see a lot of effort going into that program and those resources diverted elsewhere. So we'll start with you, Secretary Sarah Copeland-Hansis. Our Secretary of State, why have you decided to focus some of your office's limited resources on increasing voter turnout among this specific population?
Well, I think at its foundation, when we live in a democracy, we are supposed to be living in a structure where people can tell their government what's working and what's not working, and can ask their elected leaders to fix the problems that they see. And this is a population who may have, some unique perspective on that. But I think what's probably not unique about incarcerated folks is that they have experienced the same challenges of not being able to find affordable housing, or juggling, a low-wage job and having those stressors compound, your everyday existence. And so, folks who have experienced poverty or housing instability should have the ability to tell their elected leaders what they thought. And, voting is just one way to do that.
Tim, what would you say to somebody like Nora who wrote in with some perhaps frustrations about the fact that incarcerated individuals can vote in Vermont?
So I understand where Nora's coming from, and I understand that position. I would say that this is a piece of reentry, right? If we can get people voting active in their communities, then we can have better communities. So the discussion really can be sort of segmented in, do we want people just to go to prison, stay there, have no rights, and just get back out to repeat the same behaviors? Or do we want people who are incarcerated to have the ability to understand what's happening in their communities, in their state, and in their federal government? Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Kristen, what are your thoughts?
Well, I would love to follow up from both comments and push back just a little bit. Is that even though someone may be incarcerated, they generally maintain their basic rights, okay? So they can still get married, they can get divorced, they can buy and sell property. So not all rights are removed when someone is incarcerated. And we should also just take a holistic view at the importance of voting, right? So when we talk about creating positive self-identities, voting is part of that. Maintaining connections to our communities, voting is part of that. Most of the people who are incarcerated will come home. And we also know the Sentencing Project has a report on voting and its connection to increasing public safety. So there's also work out there that says voting is related to also improving public safety. So these would be all the things that we would want to happen that are positive, building identity, keeping people connected to their communities, and ultimately making us all safer.
Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hansis, you're officially launching this task force next week. What should we be expecting to hear about it? What's coming up next, or is this just going to be ongoing work that's kind of happening until the 2026 elections?
Well, we certainly hope that there will be some actionable outcomes for each of the categories of voters that we've identified with this task force. I think I want to put one more plug out there that the Secretary of State's office will be creating a voter guide for all general elections. And so that is a low-cost, no subscription way for every voter to know the people and the issues that are on their ballot. And so I certainly hope that incarcerated individuals, as well as all of the other folks that we talked about, will know that they can access information about who's on their ballot ahead of the election.
Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hanzus, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Michaela.
Tim, you just gave a little thumbs up to something that she said there.
First of all, I appreciate the Secretary's efforts. The question becomes, how many people who've been formerly incarcerated are on these task force? And it's not just on voting. It's bringing the voice of people who have been directly impacted, by the way, both victims' communities and the people incarcerated, and saying, how do you feel about these task force, and where are your efforts, and how can we include you in those conversations?
Yeah. Kristen, when you were studying both Maine and Vermont, did you see the voices of people who are formerly incarcerated being included in some of these conversations around voting, or is there still work to do in that area?
I would say there's still work to do in that area. And a lot of it is just education, right? As the Secretary was talking about, is keeping those education programs open and running, having them consistently staffed so that incarcerated people know that they have the right to vote, but that they can also learn about government, right? All the ins and outs of that. And then you have Maine, who has the NAACP chapter. I mean, and they are truly the workhorse in that state. It's like they're doing so much work with education and in-person registration drives and so on and so forth. So it's just something that needs a lot of commitment. And then just to debunk too those myths that if I'm incarcerated, I can no longer vote while completing a sentence for a felony.
Yeah. Kristen, are there other states that are looking into expanding voting rights to incarcerated people?
Sure. So right now we've got a small number of states that have pending voting in prison bills. So it's Illinois, Massachusetts, Oregon, and then also Washington State. So if they, by chance, all passed their voting in prison bill, you'd have about 67,000 voters that would be reenfranchised.
Wow. Oh, Tim, you work on a lot of different issues facing folks who are incarcerated. And today's conversation obviously focused very specifically on voting. But for future conversations on this topic and on this population, I'm curious what the most common things that you're hearing about from incarcerated people are. I mean, is it access to the ballot? Or I imagine there's lots of other very pressing issues.
So there are giving a voice to people who are incarcerated because they're still citizens. They're still people from our communities who are going to go, as Kristen said, back to our communities. And, I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of conversation right now in the public realm about people who, the revolving door of, and I think it's really important to understand that, extreme sentences are an issue in Vermont, extreme or life sentences, and how to address, because our population is growing and our staffing is shrinking. And I think that those issues have to come up quickly.
Are staffing in prisons?
Staffing in corrections. Yeah, there's a very the numbers are going down for people who are willing to take the jobs, and they're hard jobs. And then we keep incarcerating people, and so you're growing populations and shrinking the people who we want to keep our communities safe.
Yeah. Yeah, and Kristen, I think it was you, or perhaps it was the Secretary of State, who brought this up, that when there is that turnover in corrections staff, that you lose some of the knowledge base about programs like how to get people access to the ballot. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I think policies and writing things down and having training materials. So when you do have that turnover in staff, you have a resource, right? You have someone who can train the next person who will take on these very important duties to make sure incarcerated people can vote. And the same thing goes with incarcerated people who are literally grassroots advocates on the inside, making sure that other folks know that they can vote, and voter education. So putting in the building blocks there, the foundation to continue that education and that passing on of knowledge.
Kristen Budd is a senior research analyst at the Sentencing Project and the author of a new report about Vermont and Maine's incarcerated voting programs. You can find that on the Sentencing Project's website. Kristen, thank you so much for telling us about your research.
Thank you, Michaela. It's been a great pleasure. And also thank you to the Secretary and Tim for joining us today. It's been wonderful.
Yes, Tim Burgess is the executive director of Vermont Cure, which supports Vermont's incarcerated population in lots of different ways. Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, we have to take one more quick break, but stick around because when we come back, we are going to learn about this really interesting program in Rutland that is helping formerly incarcerated people who also struggle with drug addiction, starting when they are still in prison. The program is also expanding statewide right now. You can learn more about that in just a minute on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. October is Substance Use Prevention Month, which brings us to our next conversation, which comes to us out of Rutland. More than half of Vermont's incarcerated population has a diagnosed opioid use disorder. And if you add alcohol to the mix, that percentage goes even higher. Overdosing is the leading cause of death among people who are recently released from incarceration. That's why, in part, the Turning Point Center of Rutland launched a peer recovery coaching program in 2016. It's now partnered with the Department of Corrections, and this program is active in correctional facilities and probation and parole offices all across the state. It connects participants with lived experience coaches who provide support for them before and after their release from prison. To learn more about this program, I called up Tracy Hawk this morning. She's the executive director of the Turning Point Center of Rutland.
The early days were just mainly we were going into the Marble Valley Regional Correctional Facility and providing two different recovery support groups, a Making Recovery Easier group and a Smart Recovery group. We were doing those each one had an afternoon that we would go in like an hour and a half to do the group. And individuals would receive certificates of completion once they completed those groups. And many people ended up keep coming to the group, even after they've earned their certificates. And we did monthly presentations. So that's what it looked like in the beginning.
And what do you do with a certificate once you get one? What's the benefit of that?
The benefit is if they have a court date coming up, it shows the work that they've been doing while they're incarcerated. It shows that they're working on their recovery and kind of learning new tools so that they can hopefully maintain their recovery when they get out.
The program started in 2016, and then a couple years later, you all connected with Vermont's Corrections Department to try to expand it to other corrections facilities. How did that change the program?
Well, it brought a lot more work, and it also brought, each one of the recovery centers are their own separate nonprofit. So everybody is at different levels of capacity. So it brought forth the struggle of finding people that are ready to go in as recovery coaches into a correctional facility and getting them training so that they feel comfortable going into the facilities. It's a lot about building the workforce capacity to do this work.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about what it takes to be one of the volunteers who goes into these facilities and meets with folks who are incarcerated, who are struggling with substance use disorder? What makes a good volunteer?
Well, they're staff here. They're not volunteers. They're considered volunteers when they go into the Marble Valley Correctional Facility or any of the correctional facilities because They go on a volunteer status. But as far as staffing here at the center, it generally, and each center is a little bit differently, the way that they onboard people. But generally, people have to have a year of solid recovery at least. Some centers require a little longer than that. And then also they need to understand what our mission is, that we're supportive of multiple types of recovery, multiple pathways, and they have to have good boundaries and ethics. You also need to be sure that, if they have a past history of being incarcerated, is it going to be triggering for them or traumatic for them to go back into a correctional facility? And they have to be able to follow the rules of the correctional facility as far as volunteer status goes, which means having no personal contact outside of the coaching relationship and through the center with any of the individuals that are being held there. So there's a lot of details, and there's a lot of prep you need to do with individuals. They also have to be able to pass a background check to be able to go into the facility. So if they have charges, it depends on how long ago they were. It depends on the status of what they've done in the last few years. That's all decided through the correctional facilities.
Have there been issues with that in the past? I mean, you mentioned a couple different things that could be difficult for somebody who has their own history with the carceral system about going in and working with somebody there. Has that been tough for staff?
It has, but we haven't had any issues in the last quite a few years. In the beginning, it was a little difficult. People didn't really understand the importance of boundaries and ethics. Like if you have volunteer status to go into the correctional facility, then you can't be visiting people during visiting hours at the correctional facility. You can't exchange personal phone numbers. And some of that was some of the stuff that happened in the very beginning. But since then, and that was way back in like 2018, I think, and we haven't had any issues since then. But it really is about having that strong line of not crossing those boundaries with individuals. And it's hard because people in recovery, if you meet someone, you want to help them succeed, but you need to do it in the proper fashion, not reaching out on your own personally. It needs to be through the center.
Yeah. Can you give us a bit of an inside look into what a conversation might be like with one of your staff members who goes into one of these facilities and meets with somebody in prison, maybe hopefully getting ready for their release? What are some of the kinds of conversations that they might have together?
They have conversations about what is their recovery program going to look like? Are they going to go to 12-step meetings? Are they going to continue coaching? Connecting them with other resources there. A lot of times it may be about what their housing is going to be when they get out. That's always a big issue because housing is a big problem all across the state. So it could be talking to them about going into recovery residence, like a sober living environment, kind of explaining to them what it's like, if they need mental health supports or medicated assisted treatment, talking to them about providers that they may want to get connected with. We don't make those direct connections, but we provide them information on the resources out in the community.
And Tracy, how does your organization try to stay connected with folks after they're released from prison? Is there anything that you can do to facilitate that, or is it really up to the individual about whether or not they want to stay connected with Turning Point?
A big portion of it is up to the individual if they want to stay connected. But we also have so many other programs that even if they don't come right down to the center after they get released, we may run across them at the probation and parole office. We may see them if they get released to adult treatment court. We may see them in treatment court. We also have recovery coaches in the emergency room. So if something should happen and they end up in the emergency room, we might see them there. So we try to position ourselves, or we'll cross paths with them through all the different doorways they might pass through. Yeah. But ultimately it's up to them. We a lot of times when they get out, if they don't have phones, we don't have the information on how to get in touch with them. They don't have their phone number until they get released, and they get a phone. So it is really up to that individual.
Yeah. We've seen some changes to the broader situation with the opioids crisis. Like overdose deaths have gone down in Vermont in the last couple of years. But I wonder if you think that things have gotten like noticeably better. Are programs like this making a dent in people's lives, or is it still really an uphill battle in Vermont?
It's still an uphill battle, but I think programs like this do make a big difference. I think they provide that opportunity for individuals that are being held in correctional facilities to build a strong, trusting relationship with the recovery coach that they see in the facility, and then have that comforting feeling that they're going to see them when they get out if they show up at the center. Um, I think the difficult part is many people get released and they don't have a stable place to go. So when that happens, they're usually going and staying with people that they were with before they ended up going into the facility, and that doesn't always turn out well. Yeah. And they don't have transportation, and it tends to lead to them relapsing or going back to active use. But I think that it could. And I mean, we're still in the early stages of really making this big in a lot of the other correctional facilities, but I think there's a level of accountability. I think if they establish a relationship with a recovery coach in the correctional facility, I think what could be helpful with this is that when they get released and they go to PMP, for their supervision or whatever, that getting the probation officers to ask them, did you meet with a recovery coach? Like being able to really check in to see if they built those relationships, and then, encouraging them to continue those, because accountability is huge. And sometimes it's just people get out and they get busy with lots of appointments or whatever, or they don't have transportation and they can't get here. So I think just building that accountability, that the constant thing, you're looking for recovery, you're working towards it. Once you get out, how are you going to continue doing that? I think that's really important.
And Tracy, you've mentioned housing a couple of times. In Rutland specifically, what type of housing is needed to create more space for folks to have that kind of stable place to land? Is it like halfway houses? Is it affordable apartments to rent? What are you thinking?
I think all of the above. I think there needs to be more recovery homes for people to transition into from corrections. And then also more lower level sober homes, like level 1 sober homes, where people can kind of graduate, like a transitional program, go to a recovery house, be there for a while, maybe go to a step down place that has more freedoms. And the lack of apartments around here, if people are looking for apartments for themselves, there is none, so they end up just staying with people that they know, which are not always the best place for them to stay.
I'm wondering if there is somebody or an experience that comes to mind for you of hearing about a staffer at Turning Point connecting with somebody who is incarcerated and thinking like, hey, this is really working. This is really helping this person.
Well, I could think of a couple, 3 individuals actually that were receiving coaching services up until we got into COVID, and then we couldn't go in the facility. And then these 3 individuals were released during COVID. They maintained letter writing with their recovery coach, and they connected with us, and they are still all receiving recovery coaching today. Wow. Even though they're out. So I think the idea that this could be, kind of a harm reduction program, people stay connected. I'm not going to say they're going to be 100% abstinent, but they're doing much better in their life, and they're suiting up and showing up for the responsibilities that they have when they're released.
That's great to hear. And what do you need to keep this program going and expanding even?
Ongoing funding, people with, really good, solid recovery that are open to multiple paths of recovery. Hiring people to do this work, it's tough, and people have to have good boundaries. And a lot of times people thinks everybody should do recovery the way they did recovery. And that's not how we function. It's meeting people where they're at and where they're willing to make some changes. So I think funding is the biggest thing, and just more people that are interested in doing this work and willing to be open-minded to get the proper training to do this work in relation to our missions at the center.
That was Tracy Hawk, the executive director of the Turning Point Center of Rutland. She spoke to us in part to help us all recognize Substance Use Prevention Month, which is October. All right, that is it for today. Our show was directed by Mary Angish. John Ahrens is our managing producer. Andrea Lorien and Daniela Fierro are our producers. Today's call screener was Kelly Delorier, and our theme music is by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.